I'd like to call the order of the Pleasant Grove City Council work session on this Tuesday, May the 21st, 2019. Welcome everyone who has joined us here this evening for our first part of our sessions this evening. And I would like to begin with turn a little time over to Council Member Anderson to bring up an item.
Oh,
This would be perfect timing.
Yep.
So, this last week, one of my best friends is Jeanette Bennett. She owns Bennett Magazine, Bennett Communication, Utah Valley Magazine, Bride. And they do a little thing, and it's called The Best Of. And she was so excited to have me receive this on behalf of the Strawberry Days Rodeo. And since Denny is here tonight, so Denny, I don't know where we want to put this, but this means a lot. This is from all over the valley.
Yeah.
So we'll make sure that this is seen, but will you make sure that this is understood?
Absolutely. Thank you,
My-
and the city council.
do we have him get a picture with it and hold it up?
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, we can do that after.
Okay.
And maybe we can promote that in the Strawberry Days magazine.
Yes, that would be great.
So that's,
Anyway. Okay.
and then we'll just try to get it every year after that.
I agree with you.
I don't know.
So it's okay, thank you.
I think they're turning.
So, all right, we'll move to our item number one, new employee introductions.
Chief Roberts, did yours? Okay, so we'll postpone that to another day.
Okay,
They weren't able
postpone,
to
okay.
We're
move
moving
it tonight.
fast tonight.
We would now move to our presentation from our favorite sewer district.
Our favorite.
It's our only.
Our only.
That's like saying I love my son the best. It's the only son I have.
Mayor, if I might just quickly introduce Richard. Richard is the new manager for TSSD, and we have a couple of board members for that board of directors here tonight too, in support of Richard. We've enjoyed our work with him so far and look forward to hearing his presentation.
Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate that introduction. As he mentioned, my name is Richard Mickelson. I've been with the district since August of last year. I've come from working at multiple other cities, Central Weber up in Weber County, Brigham City, and also Provo. I've worked at all of those different facilities. As you know, your waste treatment plant provides services for the top 10 cities in Utah County. We process about 20 million gallons of water a day from your wastewater system. So what I have right over here on the right, you can see the bottle on your right, the darker one, that's what comes to us. We just pulled that fresh for you so you can see what it looks like. Yeah, you could open it up.
I'm
It
hoping that
actually-
wasn't in the same box that we're having lunch from.
Yeah,
The
Jimmy John's.
box.
Well, it comes from somewhere, so.
Later.
But I did not realize this was a brand-new, fresh building, and I'm providing the fresh aroma for it. So thank you for letting me provide that for you. So we just wanted to, we start out with that material right there, but you can see on the bottle in the middle that we remove 98% or more of the waste that comes to us. That's what your facility does. And then on the far right, you can see that's what drinking water looks like. So that is actually drinking water on your far left, the cleanest water that's over there.
Wow.
So we do a really good job. And I also want to let you know that we're regulated by the state of Utah, the Department of Water Quality. And then they put restrictions on us and tell us how clean they want the water. And letting you know that we have no violations. We're actually getting an award from NACWA that shows for the past 10 years that we've had no violations on all those parameters that the state has put upon us. And we take pride in cleaning the water, and So every one of us, we consider ourselves environmentalists because we actually do work that cleans the water. And I've handed out, given you a handout that you have in front of you right there. If you take a look at that, which that's part of my purpose here today, is to let you know the state of the waste treatment facility that you provide money for and pay for. So first of all, I wanted to start off with the personnel costs. You can see this is a national survey which is put out by NACWA, which we participate in, and we provide them information. This is only some of the information that comes out. You can see that they did a survey in 2016. You can see the personnel costs there at 45% of their facility. Here at Timpanogos Special Service District, our costs are at 27% comparing the 2016 numbers. The next one down is operational costs. At Timpanogos, we have $2,261 per million gallons. That's what the cost is compared to the other ones. We're back in the 2011, 2012 range. If you turn the page over on the other side, you'll see that we have some chemical costs and electricity costs. Our power costs are at about $162 per million gallons, and the national average is at $197, and our chemical costs are about $23.50, where the national average is right around 99 cents. And I just mentioned those. As you may have known about the phosphorus limits that have been put on us, they go into effect in 2020. And so our plant has made improvements to get to that level, but we're not quite there yet, and we've got some exemptions there letting us work to get to there. We're at about 1.3 to 1.1 million parts per million of phosphorus, and they're requiring us to get down to below 1. We're just this close to be able to meet that. We're making some changes to be able to make sure that that phosphorus limit's met. One of those is chemical, and we do a biological removal, which we're able to meet 9 months out of the year, but during the warmer months of the year, our biology doesn't react well with that, so we're trying to see what we can do to fix those. And one of the safety belts we can use is chemical, which if we add chemical, it increases our solids handling and it increases our costs. So we're trying to stay with the biology, and we're seeing what we can do with those to try to get there. And we have till 2023 with the window that they've allowed us to work with. And what I wanted to go into is what you may have heard a little bit about is Utah Lake, and Utah Lake with the phosphorus and the algae that's growing in there. I wanted to introduce to you some alternative stable states. So if you take a look at this picture right here, you can see this graph was put together by an engineering firm that's what they do for a living, is to clean up water bodies. And so they produce this graph or this chart, which DWQ is also used in some of their presentations as well. You can see on the far left, you can see parts per million of phosphorus. If you're below 25 parts per billion, you got a clear water body. There's not a lot of turbidity or in there. And if you add phosphorus, life starts to grow. And you can see that top layer right there between 25 parts per billion and 100 parts per billion. You see more life growing, fish eat that, and then more fish grow and live. But if you get too much phosphorus over on the far right-hand side, you can see what I like to call pea soup. Doesn't look really pleasant. It's a big mess. And so you think, well, if we just remove the phosphorus and get back to that 25 parts per billion to 100 parts per billion, you're going to get that clean water body. Well, that doesn't happen. As you can see from here, you still get you get the pea soup, but what's happened is, what's missing is the ecology. So you've got to make sure the ecology's there to make it work. So what that means is when it first started growing, those fish were consuming that food and using it as part of their life cycle to live and move forward. So my suggestion is that since we get that back down to the 25 parts per billion to 100 parts per billion, you need to look at the ecology. And so the next page, which I've shown you right here, is these studies were done in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So that what they do here is that they take the carp out of the picture. And you may have heard that we're harvesting, not us personally, but
Right.
people are harvesting carp out of Utah Lake in the thousands of pounds per year over the last 8 years. And this study right here showed that once they remove the carp, and the clear or the darker area, the algae is gone, but the life, the subaquatic algae or the subaquatic vegetation grows, and life ecology comes back to normal. So what I'm suggesting here is that there needs to be a study, which, as you may or may not know, there's about $2.5 million worth of study that's being done at the at the Utah Lake with respects to money. The Utah state legislators added $500,000 2 years ago to study the lake. The Water Quality Board added about $1 million, I think 2 years before that. So they're spending quite a bit of money studying Utah Lake and how to, what the state of the lake is and what it used to be like. And I'm suggesting what we should do is spend some more time studying what can we do to help the lake to recover, to get back, if it's possible. So one of the studies that we're doing here is to study the fish exclosure study to see what happens if we remove the carp, if we were able to do something with the lake and get it to recover. So that's partly what we're doing here at Timpanogos. We're doing some studies in science and research and so forth. So just wanted to let you know the state of your sewer lagoons, your sewer waste treatment system is doing well. And does anybody have any questions?
Council?
Oh, I failed to mention one thing too. So the last bag that I had right here, I was supposed to mention this. This is your compost. So we take the biosolids we remove from the sewage system, and then we put it with compost, with green waste, and we make compost out of that. As you know, that we had some litigation a couple of years ago, and this will cease on January 1st, 2021. So just let your residents know that this is still available through next year, and then after that, then we'll cease to do that operation. So.
And you won't be shipping it off-site, or will you be composting someplace else?
We currently do not have an option to compost off-site.
Okay.
Right now, we have just finished some negotiations to do all of our biosolids and working with our compost to be able to do landfill. That's what our current options are right now. We're looking at some other options to change our processes so that we can reduce our biosolids. As you know, we do, well, you may not know, we do about 38,000 tons of biosolids a year, which that means is that each one of us produce about 1 pound a day. And so we've got to be able to get rid of that waste daily. We do about 105 tons a day of solids that we have to dispose of. And if we can reduce that volume by putting in another process on the plant that will do some more reductions of the volatiles, which we think is very feasible. We're under a study right now, and we're going to be changing our process. What all that basically means is it's going to cost more to get rid of our biosolids. So anyway.
Yeah, Richard, I'm a purchaser of that mulch.
It's good, isn't
I
it?
love it.
It's very
I do.
good. So,
Yep.
yes, we currently do not have another option off-site. So I'm looking at all options. One of the directions the board has given me is we'd like to have a 200% solution. And so I'm working towards that. Right now, I barely have a 100% solution. So anyway, we're trying to keep up with it. So if you have questions, please feel free to call or come take a tour. We'd love to have you come down and see what we do. I think we do a great job down there. Okay, thank you.
So you'll take our green waste until till next year?
Probably till November-ish, October of next year.
Of next year,
Of next year, right.
okay.
So
2020.
Of 2020, yeah. So we'll, and that's, because I want to have some green waste, well, I want to do a couple of things. One, provide that service for you, and also have some for us, for other options down there that we may need. We're looking at, we find that if we add a little bit of green waste, ground green waste to the bottom of our hauling that we haul to the landfill, it comes out easier, slicks out easier. So I want to have all my options on the table right now. So
Right. Thanks, Richard.
We're very grateful for what you do, by the way.
Yeah, for sure.
thank you.
I don't think there's anything that citizens enjoy more than knowing that when they flush that toilet, it goes away.
Yeah.
Well, and it's good to get that green waste. You know, I feel good about taking my stuff down there and hopefully we can find a better solution or another solution. for the
I want
Greenway.
council to keep in mind, the litigation was instigated by us.
Yeah,
And so, I mean,
Yes.
that was us asking them to remove the composting
They're new.
on site, so. We do like to drop our green waste, but that is the trade-off to not
I
having
know.
the compost
That's
on
right.
site.
I do have a question on the lake health. I know that I've heard conversations of dredging. Does that change your studies? Does dredging, will that help with the health of the lake?
Two things. One of them is with the lake is really, really old. It's all Bonneville Lake. It's been concentrated down for years and years and years. Some of the studies that they're studying right now is how much phosphorus is there and how much can come back into it that's just in the bed of it. So which comes to your point is, will dredging help it? If you can make the lake deeper, it'll make it so that it will stay cooler. As the water's cooler, then you will have less chance for the algae to grow. It's kind of like, do you like hanging out in Hawaii? It's nice. You get some nice things going on there. Well, that's the case with the algae. It's nice and warm. It'll grow, and then you'll have more algae. So the deeper it is, the colder you can keep it. So that's actually a benefit. I don't think it'll mess the studies up that we're doing right now.
Okay.
It's just what is the community going to do with Utah Lake? It's shallow, flat, heats up easy, algae grows easy. So that's one solution. That's correct. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn, for arranging for this.
You betcha.
So, now I'll move to item number 3. And I believe that Marty's going to give us a presentation. We're going to be discussing the engineering concerns on our hillside development in Pleasant Grove.
Hey, it's still coming on here.
So Diana, just to answer your question, Utah Lake is never going to look like Bear Lake, even if they dredge it, okay? So anyway, just to make sure you,
But I have heard, just while Marty's pulling up electronics, that a Dubai-like development, so you dredge and you create islands, and then those islands is now new real estate, which is how they're going to fund the project. But in that dredging, that the lake would be healthier.
True too. So, can I just?
Yeah, it's not up yet.
it's not up
So
here yet.
if you make that lake 30 feet deep, then there's chances that you can make that zones be cooler. And if you can make that cycle in and keep that water cold, then it may not be a Bear Lake where it's crystal clear, but you could.
Deep blue.
You could reduce the algae growth. That is definitely a possibility. And on that too, you'd have to also, some of the scientists are saying, make it so that you actually have some wetlands that can be engineered, designed to help the ecology that I was talking about before, and make that work. But anyway, that's definitely an option.
And instead of a causeway, have bridges that go to the island so that you're not disrupting the flow of the water as well, so.
That court is a little temperamental.
Shows that it's kicking it over. But
I would love to. Okay.
There's mine. You can try that.
it worked last week or 2 weeks ago.
With that same court.
No. Hey,
Oh, that's better.
you can have this one back. And do what you would like with it. All right, Mayor, Council, glad to be with you to discuss one of the things that we kind of deal with as far as development up on the bench. There's been some questions recently and through the years. It's been many, many years that there's been a lot of discussion about the Pleasant Grove bench and where our current city boundaries are, what the options are for development above our, or outside of our city boundary, and that's the question that we're trying to answer today, is get some direction with regards to what
Marty
the council feels on this
or
subject.
Kyla, is there a way we can switch Marty's picture, what he's presenting, bigger so the citizens can see it? Or are you working? Oh, okay, all right, okay. There we go.
There, that's better. Okay.
I don't know what picture you're talking about, so I can't see it. But as you can see, our city boundary here along the bench, really, we're talking about the area from Grove Creek down to 1000 South. That's our boundary with Linden. That's the area north of there is largely owned by Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy. We do have a little bit, I think, owned by Robert Bingham, but for the most part, it's on a really, really steep slope, not necessarily developable. But from 500 South Grove Creek Drive, 500 North Grove Creek Drive, all the way down to 1000 South, there is some area that's outside of our boundaries up here on the bench that looks like potentially developable area up on the bench. So what we wanted to do today is get some direction from the council on their feelings towards potential annexation of this property and whether or not it's even in the cards. And so as we discussed this a little while ago, we thought we would present to you all of what we see as concerns of annexing that property into the city and what things we need to consider as a city when we do that. What does that mean for us and each one of our utility systems, our street systems, potential failure with regards to slope, stabilities, rockfall, all of those things. And so what I've done is I've prepared a little kind of write-up. I've worked with John Shees has helped out greatly with the utility information, and we've sat down and discussed that, and I've also talked with Chief Thomas to talk a little bit more about the fire safety and things up in that area. And so what I've prepared in that report, I'd like to just go through and discuss those items. And that is, really quick, I wanted to show this map that kind of shows, these are the privately owned parcels up on the bench between Grove Creek and our south boundary. And really outside of that is either owned by North Utah County, Pleasant Grove City, an entity, not necessarily private party, not private land ownership. United States of America owns most of the tracts that are adjacent to these parcels.
Does, where would, I know probably what the closest thing we have up there would be Walker, is it Walker Estates or something would be kind of what we're
So
talking about?
you've got some things up here. Walker Ridge, Plat B,
Walker
if you
Ridge.
remember, is this area right here. There, Black Hawk, all these properties are down here. So one of the things that's, I haven't been here for 14, 15 years, but there's always been that line up there has largely followed the Salt Lake Aqueduct. And all of our systems have mainly been designed to accommodate that to our boundaries, essentially. So the water systems all are pressured to those boundaries to make sure that we can provide service to the people that are within our current boundaries. But above that, we start having problems with regards to our utility systems and providing services to those areas. So I'm going to bring this back over here. So with regards to the items, so we talked about the culinary water system as the first area that we'd like to discuss. As I've mentioned, that the Salt Lake Aqueduct is the line. That is our pressure boundary. The state does require us to maintain certain levels. 40 PSI is the minimum pressure that we can provide on our system to provide service to an area. 30 PSI under our peak day demands. And right at that boundary, it's right around there. As soon as we start getting higher than that, we start losing our ability to provide the required service. And so that Salt Lake Aqueduct, there's a little bit of flexibility, but it's within 10 or so feet of elevation. And as you know, as you go up those hills, you gain that in a couple hundred feet. And so you lose that ability to go any higher than that really quick. And I think that line is a good line for our culinary water system. When you talk about what would need to happen in order to provide service to that area, we would have to create an upper pressure zone in our system. Essentially, you have to be able to provide fire flow, so you would have a water tank of some size, probably 500,000 gallon minimum is typically for getting enough volume for firefighting. And it would have to be somewhere high enough to provide the minimum pressures. That, again, that 40 PSI is the minimum. We like to design around 50, but 40 PSI would be the minimum that we could provide to any resident at their meter. And so that would be one of the key things, is getting a separate system that may tie down through as far as an overflow could come into it, but we would have to create separate lines, probably a booster pump station that would pump from the Battle Creek tank area, and after it's been chlorinated, goes into our Battle Creek tanks. Another booster pump system would have to pump up the hill to a higher pressure zone, and it would feed down through that area. So that's one of the first things. Now, there's some questions, well, what of that could be private? Well, because we are governed by the Division of Drinking Water, we have to meet all of the state standards. It's very difficult for us to hand off something as a tank or a pump station or something of that nature. And that's not something that I would recommend that we do as a city, is make something of that nature private and make them responsible to meet the state standards, because we will be the ones in the end responsible to make sure that it meets drinking water standards. So we're essentially monitoring somebody else to do what has to be done to meet those standards, which I wouldn't recommend. We would be better off just managing it ourselves if we're going to do that. So the pumping station and a tank would likely be necessary. There would be, in this memo we mentioned about potentially coming off above the current power generation station there, our Battle Creek Springs area. There is some pressure available above that that we feed our power station with. And so we would be taking above that and potentially going over to a tank system, but then we would have to put in a chlorination system to chlorinate that before it goes into the tank, totally separate, run a separate line. There's just a lot of complications with regards to providing culinary water service up on the bench this high. We just don't have a system planned or intended. Our master plans would have to be updated to accommodate the area to make sure that we can provide the water up there. We currently pump from the Monson tanks all the way up to the Battle Creek tanks. And so if we don't have enough source in Battle Creek at times, we would be pumping twice. So everything with regards to landslides and other things of that nature up in this area also comes in concerns with our culinary water system, because you're going to have water lines in the roads. You have potential shifts, movements of the ground. You now have potential for really saturating areas and causing further damage when you have those areas. We've seen that in some communities. We've North Salt Lake and up on the Provo Bench, and there's a number of areas that are currently dealing with those. We've seen the slides in Cedar Hills as well. They just cause concerns for communities. And so the question is do we put our systems up there and then have these potential failures and risks that those cause? With regards to the pressure irrigation system, I don't know that it would make sense for us to try to service that above there, but if we did, then it would likely take a separate pressure pumping, a pumping station to do that. It would likely just be provided through a culinary water system. But again, that creates further demands on our culinary water needs to do that. But it would be, to do a separate pressure irrigation system above where we currently serve would be very difficult. Take some sort of a pressure pump out of one of our ponds. Again, same concept with regards to saturating areas. If you do have leaks, and you'll always have leaks at some point, you'll have to deal with those. You'll have to deal with faults. There are a number of faults up on the bench this high up. If I remember doing the review of the debris basin at Battle Creek when it was with JUB, we were looking at whether or not we could use that as a pressure irrigation reservoir before we built the Battle Creek Reservoir. And it just came back. I think there was about 6 or 7 faults identified through just the basin. And the bench has a number of faults, and so there's potential there, not necessarily that it's happened or will continue to happen. There are known slide areas, slides that have happened in the past. You can visibly see them in some situations, so they're going to happen at some point. You can do what you can to mitigate them, but you're not always 100% successful in mitigating slide areas. You don't know what's happening underground exactly. You do your best in guessing that, but at some point you're going to have to deal with it. Storm drain system, for the most part, we would just have to redo all of our planning, making sure that we can accommodate additional storm flows from these areas down through our system. It would just connect at the bottom end and somehow be able to work down through our systems. Likely need to be detained in order to accommodate some of those areas up there, just because we don't have very substantial storm drain utilities up on the bench that high, and getting that water down through the system would be a little bit difficult. With regards to the street system, because it is a little bit isolated, some of these areas, and we didn't want to talk specifically about any one specific development, just wanted to talk in general. They all require some sort of a network of roads to get up to them. We always have to provide the primary access and a secondary access, typically just a road in, a road out. And so up in this area, there are a lot of steep slopes. Getting those up in there, a lot of over the years, some of the studies that I've seen have gotten pretty close to meeting the 10% maximum grade requirements. A lot of them are pushing those up to the 14% to be able to get those to work. And so they become, I guess, a further issue of trying to maintain, you're higher on the bench, you're going to get more snow, pushing the snow on steep slopes, higher risk for plow drivers, other things of that nature. There are a lot of concerns when you start getting higher on the bench. I was just talking with Alpine City, in fact, a couple weeks ago, and Shane Sorensen over there was talking about a development that they just barely built, and they've now had to go retrofit all of their a couple of their plow trucks to be able to plow in that area with some chains on all of their trucks, and they're considering getting a four-wheel drive plow now so that they can even plow the areas. And that's what happens when you start dealing with steep roads. So it's not only from our purposes, but talking also with Chief Thomas from Emergency Services, being able to get up there. There's a question whether or not we're going to have adequate equipment, or the road's going to be cleared. It just creates another level of concern when there is an emergency, whether or not you can get to these areas that are higher up on the bench. And so that's there are a number of other issues with regards to retaining, how you get down from these upper bench areas. You would have to put in retaining walls, other features that are, and they may be installed by others, but in the end, then you're going to be maintaining those in perpetuity as a city. And so we as a city would then be taking responsibility to maintain those potentially. Again, there's always that private development concept that they fully maintain, but at the same time, there becomes further issues down the road, and we're not talking 5 years, we're talking the 20 and 30 years down the road when you start seeing problems and issues. Does the city feel like that we would be actually not involved in issues that are created in these communities or within our boundaries? They're part of our communities, and that's why in the past we've got rid of the PUD ordinance, which allowed for some planned developments, just because we were starting to see creep in some of those long-term effects of having private developments. That is, they're paying the same taxes, they're paying the same road fee, they're not getting any of those benefits because they're paying for their roads as well. They come back to the city and start saying, well, why are we, why can't you take over our roads? Why are we maintaining these roads? And anyways, it just becomes a big political issue. Generally, it's in the future. It's hard to be seen at this time. Initially, you won't see those likely, but in the future, there is a potential risk for those to be seen. Again, some of the other considerations just quickly, development, road cuts, tanks, just visibility of this is all on the face of the mountain, right? So not that other communities don't have it, you see it as you go along, but it does create a visual aspect that should be considered. Geological faults, we talked about those.
So Marty, really quick on that, how do like Alpine or these other cities handle that? Because some of them do have homes up a little higher than I imagine their tanks, right? But
Yeah. I know that the area that we went out and looked at, we were dealing with some pressure reducing valves, and it was really interesting. They pump up to a higher tank, and then it all comes down through pressure, but they have to pump it initially, and then they have pressure reducing valves as they come down to be able to provide the service to the different zones. So in their situation, they've actually got 3 or 4 zones that were created to be able to provide service to these small little areas as it comes down off the hill, so that you can provide them the right pressures at their house. So, but yeah, that's how I've understood it. I don't know a lot about their systems, but when we went out there, that's what they were doing. They were pumping up to an upper tank on the side of the hill.
Bountiful did it too. The B was really the only thing that was up there, and now there's houses above the B. But aesthetically, I mean, since they were talking about that.
Any other questions for Marty?
Well, I don't think Marty's done yet, though.
Well, and really just a runoff, you got mountain runoff, you've got rock slides, other things of that nature. Again, when you start creeping up into these areas, then you have to start dealing with those concerns. And
Expensive.
it's not that a lot of areas don't, right? There's a lot of cities, you can go all the way up and down the Wasatch Front. The question is what is the city willing to risk? What is our liability when we start encroaching into these areas? We've already got a lot of areas up on the bench, pretty high, steep roads. If you go up some Center Street and a few other ones, they're steep roads. They're difficult to get to. But now we're talking about extending that even further for a very small area, then we're going to incur a lot more risk inherently with that. And the question
Marty,
is
is there
what do we do?
current requests, formal requests from landowners?
There has not been a formal annexation request. We did have a request for a development. In fact, that was supposed to go to DRC today that we postponed because they were proposing a development outside of our current boundaries, which we couldn't do. So I know that there's interest. I've heard from a number of developers that their interest in trying to see whether or not the council is interested in annexing further beyond our boundaries up here on the bench, and that's why we're trying to come and so we can give a clear, hey, right now there's not an interest to do this, or there is an interest and you need to go through the process to be able to annex.
So let's say a tank has to go in. Do we pay for that? Or does
We-
the developer, and then we maintain it, or how does that?
Right. We likely, as part of the annexation, would indicate that they would be responsible for installing all the infrastructure needs to provide service to that area. So water tanks, pump systems, roads, all of that would be part of the development cost. And then it would be turned over to the city for us to maintain in perpetuity. So replacement costs, other things of that nature, obviously would be ours going forward, but they would initially bear that cost.
And then let's say a landslide occurs. Who's held liable for that? Is it the city for approving the development? Is it the developer? Who's liable?
developer's long gone.
City.
It's the city, because we would require engineering studies and then we would accept and give those permits out, so it would be our responsibility.
At that point, it's been annexed by us.
So just sorry to kind of explain why we're here is generally when people come in and inquire about developing up there, when they talk to staff, we generally tell them that this is not something that the city wants to entertain. And that's been because past councils have said, we're not interested in developing on the bench. We're not interested in changing our city boundaries to accommodate that. So we've had a couple inquire in the last year or two that are feeling like they're getting the push off from staff. And so we're bringing it back to you again, council, to say, okay, are we still there? Is this still something as a city council that we want to maintain the boundary so that when the developers come in, we can tell them, our city council's looked at it and they've said, we're not interested in extending our annexation or extending it to developments on the bench. And so we just need some feedback from you. And if we talked about this a couple months ago and the feedback was, well, let's get some engineering behind it so we have an understanding what's on the table. Because ultimately, as staff, when we look at this, we don't see an upside to the city. We only see downside. We only see potential risk, potential liability. The only thing we really have to gain is some property tax, and that property tax generated from that development is not going to come anywhere near close to handling the issues. Property tax is going to be a general fund deal, and it's going to go and it's going to pay for police protection and fire protection and some of the general fund services. But when things start breaking down and we have to replace a tank or we have to do this or do that, replace a pump, that's now coming out of the utility rates, which the whole city is going to pay for. I mean, and this is the hard part. Development comes in, particularly, if they're gonna say, we'll do a private development, we'll handle all the services and we'll do all that, then ultimately, the city has to understand that when things start breaking down, the developer has since gone, and now it's the HOA approaching the city saying, hey, our streets are falling apart, and we don't have enough money to repair them, city, we need you to bail us out. And the only reason we say that is because it's happening today in other cities across the nation, and we used to have a PRUD ordinance that we took out 10 years ago because of similar situations. We do have communities in our city right now that are private communities, and there was not this upside for the city for us to continue doing that. And so, I mean, our recommendation is just keep the boundary where it is. Allow us as staff that when people come in to say, hey, we're not interested in changing the boundary, they can always, if they want to really have the council look at the issue, they can apply for an annexation. Even if staff's saying, hey, our council's not willing to entertain this, they can still apply for the annexation and they can go through the process. The problem is when they start doing this, they're gonna start pumping money into this. And most of them are coming to us saying, before we dump millions of dollars in engineering, we wanna know if there's a chance that this is gonna happen. So they can always go through the process and get a final answer. But as staff, we're trying to kind of make sure that they have an understanding that, hey, we've already discussed this in general, and generally speaking, our council is not willing to entertain it unless you say, you know what, we want to be able to entertain these, then we'll just run them through the process and they can, planning commission, city council, and eventually see where it lands.
Marty, what's the average slope of these private?
Again, it varies, right? There are little plateaus, little areas that are amenable to actually being conducive to development happening. It's getting to and from those locations that are probably the bigger concern.
Okay.
And then are those areas actually on somewhat of a slide, something that would have to be mitigated?
Right.
In most cases, yes, but
Okay, so you don't know an average slope of
I don't know if
those
you could,
properties.
No.
It's fine.
All depends on how they're developed and.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks, Marty.
Anything else for Marty?
It just worked.
So council, how do you, let's just kind of,
Well,
any input on how you feel about what the staff's thrown at us, Sarah?
No, I think we talked about it last time, right, Marty? The last 10% is always the most interesting part of the engineering on these types of things. And the cost is a hard one for the city, so, yeah.
Yeah, I see high liability. That's kind of why I'm looking for slope to compare it with the other cities that have had problems. There's a big liability if those high sloped lands are developed and it's only a liability to us. We're going to be the ones that are fronting that cost, as Scott said. So, my recommendation is we just keep the property lines where they are, the city boundary lines where they are. And not entertain.
Okay. Then what do you,
I'd say you stay with the recommendation of
take
the
with the
staff.
recommendation?
I
Diane?
would like to live on Indian Springs, so if somebody would like to build back behind the G Mountain. Has anybody hiked back there? Anybody done the Battle Creek to Grove Creek?
Bring a tent and you can.
That
Yes.
is a pretty area.
My big concern is we all pay utilities, and I see all of our utility rates going up to accommodate it. There have been high-profile stories at North Salt Lake, Cedar Hills. And so those give me angst. I have no problem with the aesthetics, the development. I like the idea of people being able to develop land, but I just what you've said, the cost of maintaining all of those services just seems very high for the rest of us.
I think for me, a slide is probably the worst thing that could happen. There's a slide that could happen on those hills. It's a major problem for the city.
All right.
You want me to go again? Again, it's just it's the overall cost, right? When it comes down to it, when these facilities or tanks are handed over to us, then we're in charge of maintaining them. I mean, Marty, I read through some of your stuff, like what Alpine goes through and some different cities on the snowplow and in fire and police. It's a difficult decision to make, right? It's just, it comes down to, again, we are, in the end, it's the citizens who foot the bill, right? When we take over these services, it's a hard one to turn around and, because I'd love to have a house up there, right? The greatest views around,
Yeah.
right? But with that comes certain costs that, again, that's why he's talked about the last 10% is always the most expensive for these engineers or developers. When they come in, they can get everything up until that last 10%, and then there's those costs that are associated with said development, and sometimes that 10% comes back on the city, right? Because we're in turn, we can't just hand, like Marty said, we just can't turn that over as far as the water and things like that. So that's a big concern of mine.
If somebody presented a project that was engineered and was cost-effective, that it wouldn't,
I just don't know.
Future liability that I'd be worried about.
the future.
Well, I'm just trying, how do we answer Marty's question about the water handoff, right? We can't hand that off.
Big
and-
issue there,
Water.
ongoing costs.
I mean, sure, if there's a way, I mean, that's why I was saying other cities deal with this. I just don't know.
If they built the tanks and if they absorbed all of the costs into the sale of the
Which they would,
lot.
which they
Right.
would.
have to.
They
Right,
have to.
but so if they built the tank, they did everything, would,
Then 10 years down the road or 15, whatever.
Years.
But we now own the tank,
It's,
Yeah.
it's 10, 20,
so they give it to us,
30
so
years
it's the
that are-
long-term maintenance that causes the
Yeah.
concern.
If there was a slide, if there was a,
can you get bonding for that? Could you bond, like, keep a bond for that
Well, I
for
don't
30
know.
years?
We asked the developer to give us $5 million just in case, I don't know, but.
No, I don't think legally we could do bonding for that. And besides that, every time we've tried to do long-term bonding, performance bonding, the actual costs outrun what we keep, and so we end up with a deficit anyway.
Sid?
I'm in agreement with what's been said with the liability, high costs. Yeah. Mayor,
Move back at
What-
you.
what's your thoughts?
Well, I think it's just the long-term cost. You think you'd like to see the hillsides develop, but like I say, let's learn from our neighbors and, hey, it's not in our city now, so let's not add it,
exactly.
so. And we'll save a lot of grief for future councils down the road. Okay.
One question, so are there restrictions in building up the canyons?
It's Forest Service.
Yeah, it's
No,
Forest
but
Service.
so,
By landowners?
yes, so can the Forest Service sell land to?
No, they won't
Okay.
sell land.
Okay,
Yeah, they won't give that up.
The idea
But they're-
is the services. If somebody's gonna build, then they need water, they need sewer, that's the type of stuff. And so that's why they would want to annex into the city, is because we provide those services.
I'm saying up the canyons.
Yeah,
as
so
opposed
a random house, a cabin or something like that, I mean, I think that's a different situation. We're talking about a full-blown subdivision, and
And I
little
understand that.
different,
I
yeah.
was just now putting myself up in Indian Springs, so I was just wondering if I could put,
Let that be just one of your dreams, okay? In your dreams.
I'm putting it out there.
Okay, if nothing else, I think you have direction from the council. So thank you, Marty, on that, for enlightening us on that. So we'll move on to our item,
Mayor, if it's okay, we'll handle that next item at the end of council meeting.
okay,
We have 10 minutes before council. If we want to take a brief break, then,
Oh,
because this next item will take longer than 10 minutes to go
Okay.
through.
all right.
Mayor, I'll make a motion to adjourn our work session.
Second?
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned.